just before we start, there's just one pre-announcement is that we are in the period of the call for papers for BESA's annual conference in Brighton this year. Please do apply should you have something interesting to present. If you go through our working group, you can be in touch with me or Sam or Nancy to get any feedback on proposals or roundtable ideas or panel ideas. We're always happy to help. The more the merrier is our kind of thing. We've got a great bunch of people who will always be willing to offer feedback on papers at the conference itself as well. So please consider going to Brighton this summer if you can. So that's the one big announcement. And now to move to today's session on public engagement. And this is brilliant because I think, as I was saying before the meeting, there's a lot of interest in how we academics get our work out into the sort of out beyond academia and policy, quote, policy practitioners and academia and to the public at large. And I think that's just a great thing because it's not like people are not interested in the work that we're doing and the issues that we're grappling with. So for us to, as academics, to be able to have conversations with as many people as possible about the work we do, I think that's just in general, that's a really good thing. But it's also something, let's be honest, that universities and funders are interested in doing. Fortunately for today's seminar, we've got three fantastic speakers who have very kindly given up their time to present. And on the invite, you've hopefully seen what they do and clicked on the links to the videos, podcasts, and comic books, but they'll be able to show in more detail. So first of all, I'll just run through the three of you. For those who don't know, we've got Adrian Gallagher, Professor of Global Security and Mass Atrocity Prevention at the School of Politics and International Studies at the University of Leeds, whose research focuses on mass atrocity prevention, genocide, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing and war crimes under the Responsibility to Protect. And Adrian is also the co-director of the European Centre for the Responsibility to Protect and editor of the journal Global Responsibility to Protect. Then after Adrian, we've got Dr. Elly Harrowell, and Elly's work draws on peace and conflict studies, political geography and critical heritage studies, in order to understand how people and the environments they live in are affected by conflict and natural disaster, and how we can use this information to rebuild sustainably peaceful communities after crisis. Elly's worked with UNESCO and the International Centre for the Study and Preservation of Restoration of Cultural Property to advance this work. And finally, Michaelina Jakala, and Michaelina is an ethnographer by trade. And Michaelina's research broadly focuses on the everyday experiences of peace building and transitional justice, with particular interest in justice, reparation, and education amongst marginalized groups. Mick has had experience with participatory research and arts-based methods. So with all of that in mind, we're going to hand over to Adrian and Elly, then Mick, and then we're going to have some time for Q&A at the end. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Adrian to kick things off.
Thank you, David. I'll just share my screen. Hopefully this works. Can you see the slides? Is that okay?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, I'll just crack on. I can't see any of you, but so be it. Thank you very much, obviously, to BESA for the support along the way, and the BESA working group for the invite today. I'll just set a timer. So I do feel somewhat of a fraud because I don't see myself as an expert in this area. And since joining social media, I've seen some academics on TikTok and Instagram with hundreds and hundreds of thousands, if not millions of followers. But I will share some lessons that I've learned today. So I'm just going to talk briefly about the moral responsibility of public engagement, just in one slide. And then 5 barriers to public engagement, because I think if you're not doing this already, these may be the fears that you have. So I thought I'd touch on those. And then what I've done and some of the lessons that I've learned along the way. So this came out from the Carnegie Institute last month, I think it was, and essentially what they're saying is that the old way of doing things, the public came last in the process, and that academics would think about disseminating the knowledge that they're creating and advancing through think tanks, universities, etc. And it's kind of, I guess it was based on a trickle-down approach, that we hoped that we would create these things and it would trickle down. They're saying that this way of doing things has collapsed. And why? Because shared trust has gone. And one of the things that's come screaming through to me through social media engagement is that the public have really lost trust in institutions such as the mainstream media. So the Carnegie report states that now the public attention flows through a far more diffuse competitive ecosystem. And I think what's interesting is that you see social media being used as a weapon and social media being used as a form of resistance. And then you think of how academics are meant to play out in this ecosystem. And essentially the Institute calls on academics and universities and think tanks, etc., to grapple with this new era. So I, of course, 100% agree with this. This is kind of what got me into this in the first place. But I had to tackle these 5 obstacles that I would like to go through before I go into what I did. So I'm just going to talk about fear, knowledge, technology, time, and cost. So one is quite simply knowledge. You may not know how to record these videos on your phone and edit them and add captions, etc. So I did a private workshop, and it taught me things, just straightforward things, such as filming in portrait, not landscape, using grid lines, using editing software such as CapCut or Instagram Edits. Instagram Edits is a new thing released by Instagram, and it's free, whereas CapCut used to cost me £21 per month. There's obviously fear in that I personally did not want to be on the camera or anything like anywhere near social media, quite happily living in a little village on my own away from the world. But I realized when I went to this workshop that if you don't want yourself on camera, then you have to produce an awful lot of what they call B-roll footage that you can then talk over. And this multiplies the problem of time exponentially, because you just need so much B-roll that you would just not have enough time to gather it. The third thing is technology. I've had very well-known professors email me about this, and I'm just using just a smartphone. I don't use a tripod, a wireless mic, or a gimbal, but maybe I should, but I just use a smartphone. And personal costs. So between CapCut, boosting on Instagram, on the workshop, it's cost me about £800 to £1,000 of my own money. I think that universities and funding streams are behind the curve on this, even though they're asking us to do public engagement. But just to flag on what I mean by boosts is on Instagram, if you film for under 90 seconds, you can boost it. So I paid £3 a day just to try and get together a kind of a basis of around 2,000 followers, so that my content would be seen by at least some people, because I got shown an example of so-called best practice by the university's public engagement team, and that person had around 300 followers, and they're producing all this content that may be very good indeed, but it's not getting shown because of the way the algorithms work. So I decided to just pay for boosting out of my own pocket, so it wasn't just all wasted my time, really. But I just want to be transparent on that. I stopped paying after the first 3 months or so, and things have grown since. I want people who've not been in this sphere to know that. And time-wise, so this is a real issue, obviously, for academics. I would imagine it takes about 30 minutes for me to film and edit a 3-minute video. Just to flag that one video I did was less than 45 seconds of me just repeating something that was basically in an email I'd seen, uploading it, and that had 6,000 views. And I uploaded a photo with 3 sentences written over the top about comparing Trump's agreement with the Doha agreement, and that got 11,000 views in one day. I think total views are around 2 million now. So what am I doing? In October the 1st, 2024, I launched the A to Z in International Politics, which is obviously a letter for each alphabet linked to international relations, basically. I didn't know at the time that Instagram had strict rules on political posts because they feared that I was trying to get involved in election steering. So that hit me hard because I was structuring it around politics. The rules have been relaxed now. And also my YouTube was a dead algorithm. So I wish I'd just deleted the YouTube and started a new YouTube, but you live and learn. I got 500 followers after the first 4 posts, but that's because I was boosting. So I did 1 a week. And I boosted those. And that enabled me to have this foundation, whereas I was getting some more followers because it was growing, it was snowballing, basically. The video on Eurocentrism I found to be quite interesting because it had 2,300 views, which is not a lot compared to my modern videos, but I didn't have many followers, so it's all relative. And I had 34 comments. And I found that the public are interested in things that I didn't foresee that they would be interested in. And when it got to H, the week before H, I ran a poll saying, would people like me to look at human rights or hegemony? And they voted overwhelmingly in favor of hegemony, maybe only like 50 votes. But we have heard about human rights all our lives, but what is hegemony? Someone sent me a message. The second thing is began to see like virtual seminars in that the public debate one another in the comments section. So I saw the video on Eurocentrism to be kind of a turning point in the series when I began to realize certain things that were of interest as an academic, basically. And of course, it's not a one-way street. I have learned about all these academics on social media that are doing these things, and I didn't know that they were doing these things, and some of them with over 5 million followers. Someone at Stanford with, I think, I can't remember. But I've been introduced to new authors and new books, etc. And also learned about social media itself and what I refer to, if I'm ever to write an article on this, the digital leviathan, which is where the algorithm looks out for language. I got hit with genocide because you can't write genocide. I've continued to just write genocide. I can't be bothered to spell it differently. But algo speak is the rise of resistance language as social users use different spellings and different words and different symbols to talk about certain things. Gaza obviously looms large over all this as genocide debates. Just a flag, I bumped into an academic I know on the train, and they were saying they're on Instagram and they don't see any data. And I'd forgotten that you only see this data if you've got a business account or a creator account. So I log in, and by the way, they're free. Well, I will see a professional dashboard on my home page saying that I took these screenshots last Monday morning, and you can see 6:56. I was obviously in the gym, but 79,000 views in the 30 days. So, and then it will break it down to you. So I got 79,000 views in that month. That was 5.5 thousand interactions. So that's likes, comments, shares, saves, things like that. You can even see age range of the people. So these aren't all, I think a lot of academics think it's all 20-year-olds, and it's certainly not. You see that, well, you can see the stats there in front of you. Hopefully you can. And it's not, it is predominantly the UK. You may hope for some sort of global audience, but my experience is you are predominantly being seen by those within your own country. But there's an awful lot of data here. If you want to think about evidencing impact case studies, etc., I do wonder whether anyone will be brave enough to submit one of these as a ref impact case study. There's obviously things that would need to be considered, but you do get very heartwarming messages. I'm an Aberystwyth International Relations graduate. I just want to say thank you very much for your A to Z series. I showed this one earlier. I probably had maybe over 500, maybe well over 1,000. It'd be difficult to judge such messages. So there is that really positive side. I probably only had like 20 or so harsh comments. And just to conclude, final slide, 11 minutes done. So yeah, Carnegie is asking academics to rethink their theory of influence. I think I completely agree. And you will find that this has been a lot more positive and heartwarming than I ever anticipated. People have got in touch with me saying that they watch the videos with their families. I've had people struggling with loneliness reach out to me and say that it's helped them get through things. I had a mature student go back to university inspired by the videos, and there's 3 A-level teachers teaching A-level classes with the series. I think from an academic point of view, we are getting asked more for public engagement strategies and funding bids, which is what led to me doing this in part originally. And as I said, I wonder whether someone will be bold enough to submit something like this, an impact case study, but obviously you would need to be able to link it back to research. But yes, thank you for your time. I will leave it there and happy to answer any questions afterwards.
Brilliant stuff. Thank you so much, Adrian. That's a great place to kick things off. And yes, if you have questions, write them down and we'll have a Q&A at the end of the session. So keep them in mind. So we'll move on now to Elly. Elly's going to speak about graphic novels and comic books as a form of engagement. So I'll hand over to you, Elly.
Thanks, David. Can you see that screen okay? Brilliant. Thank you so much. And thanks, Adrian, for setting the scene really well there. I think you've made all our lives easier by kind of showing the stakes and why it is so important we think about public engagement. And it's, no longer sufficient to turn out peer-reviewed articles and books and think we've kind of done enough in communicating our message. I'm going to talk about one example, but actually the project that this sits in is one that Michaelina is also going to talk about. So I'll give a little introduction to the wider research project, and then we'll both talk about different public engagement initiatives that came out of that. So I'm going to talk about the use of comics, of graphic novels as a means for trying to communicate better and in different ways with kind of a different set of audiences, or actually maybe the same set of audience sometimes that you just want to get to pay attention in a new way. Trying to get my screen to move now and it's frozen. Oh, there we go. And so the project that we were working on, it was a kind of 6-year research project funded by the Alan and Nesta Ferguson Trust that looked at youth violence and conflict transformation. It was quite a wide-ranging project, really focused on questions such as youth agency, barriers and enabling factors to youth participation in peacebuilding initiatives, kind of formal and informal, looking at how young people experience the youth to adulthood transition in conflict-affected contexts, and how young people engage in different types of conflict prevention or conflict transformation activities, really all aimed at kind of complicating this assumption that more young people means a place is more likely to be violent or prone to conflict. The project looked at 5 different case studies, at kind of different moments of youth engagement in peace and conflict. So some that were very close to a period of extreme violence, and some that were really quite far removed from that moment of conflict, but still feeling those impacts and the after effects of that, and still negotiating the kind of social relations that emerge from prolonged periods of violent conflict. So we did research in Colombia, where I led the case study, in Algeria, in Iraqi Kurdistan, in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and in Iraq. And specifically in that final case study, it was in a very large IDP camp in Iraq, so a very kind of specific context. And we worked through collaboration with partners in each site, so usually an academic partner, but also NGO partners and kind of charities and so on, in order to try and have a good access and an equitable approach to research in those sites. throughout the project, and particularly, I mean, I'll speak from now on kind of mainly around the Colombia case study, because that's where my work was focused. I think there was a real focus on the importance of visual storytelling throughout the project, and that's for a couple of reasons. Adrian just mentioned this kind of moral responsibility we have with communication, and I think that we feel that particularly strongly where people in difficult situations have shared their story with you, and have talked about things, particularly when we work in peace and conflict. Oftentimes we are asking people to speak about some of the most challenging moments, some of the most emotionally painful moments of their lives. And I think that we do have a responsibility to do justice to those stories, not just to have them sit in our kind of academic papers, but to try and tell that story and share their experience as sensitively and with the widest possible audience. And I think visual storytelling is a really great way of doing that. I think also what we were trying to do with the methodology in this project was kind of create a feedback loop. So once we'd taken note of people's stories, to feed that knowledge back in and to kind of to generate that kind of virtuous circle of knowledge production. And so we throughout the project looked at visual storytelling as a way to achieve that. The image on the slide here, for example, with one of our kind of large workshops where we ran a lot of focus groups, we had a visual note taker who created kind of a visual record of discussions during the day to share back with participants. And then that also became the kind of part of the report that we shared back more widely at the end of it. So there was kind of this constant use of a visual language to share information throughout the project. And that's why I think it was quite a natural step then to think about, okay, well, now we've kind of coming towards the end of the project, how do we want to share the stories and share the learning from this more widely? Well, let's look to do that in a visual medium again. And that's where we got this collaboration with the organization Positive Negatives, who people on this call may have heard of or worked with before. They're an organization that seeks specifically to amplify academic research through visual storytelling. So they're very used to working with academics, and they produce these really exciting, engaging visual products, whether those are comic books or exhibitions and so on. And I should mention, I'm presenting on this today, but really I think this was the brainchild of another one of our colleagues, Chaz Morrison, who developed that relationship and really oversaw this. So unfortunately, Chaz couldn't join the seminar today, so I'm presenting on his behalf as well. But really, this is his area of kind of expertise, and he was the driving force of all of this. So through this, we developed a visual novel, a comic book, that's really made up of 5 kind of smaller comic books, one representing each case study. And the link is there for anyone who wants to go and read it and look through it. It's a really amazing document. The Colombian case study, we ended up with this book called Peace is More Than the Silence of Guns. That's a direct quote from one of the participants in our research. And what I wanted to talk about today, really focus on, is just go through the process of how did this actually work? How did we take kind of academic data and turn it into this comic book? And what were the challenges? Because there were challenges in doing it, and it's the first time I've engaged in that kind of activity, and there were certainly things I found difficult or surprising. So in terms of kind of what that process was, the first step was having a meeting with Positive Negatives and try and make sure we're all on the same page about what are the aims, what's the approach, what are we trying to do with this initiative, particularly who is the audience, who are we trying to speak to, make sure everyone understands and is on the same page with that. What kind of stories do we want to tell? Very easy, I think, when we're talking about peace and conflict, kind of get sucked into talking about the negative elements of it, or get sucked into kind of the parts that are perceived as dramatic, where there is kind of conflict and violence. But being really clear about that we didn't want to be telling a wholly negative story is really important. And also talk about the fit with the wider project. Where does this fit with the other types of things we're doing? And Michaelina will talk about the podcasts that we developed as well. So having that kind of shared sense of where we were was really important. And then the next step was to give them the data to work with. And that was actually really challenging because we had a lot of data, but, and we all know what it's like when you're doing research. Quite often the data makes perfect sense to you because you are immersed in the project and you know how it's been collected and you know what you were trying to get to. but it is not very helpful to people outside your project. And so kind of working out what format the data needed to be to share with our colleagues at Positive Negative was quite an important step in this. So cleaning it up, working out, well, first of all, giving them a sense of kind of key themes, key storylines, key events, background information, images, sometimes really important images that could help them understand kind of the visuals of the place that we've been working in, key quotes that we felt were really important. And then within our case study, because we had focus group data, we had about 16 in-depth interviews and so on, all of it, it was too big to hand over to somebody to make sense of. We ended up pulling out about 10 narratives of individuals from that and writing up kind of short vignette narratives with quotes and so on to share with the team, say, okay, here we go. This is the context of what we're talking about. These are the themes that we think came out really strongly from our research. And here they are kind of expressed through, these are, you know, the 10 key voices we thought really were compelling from the work that we did. On that basis, Positive Negative developed a script. So they took that away and said, okay, we need to now make that into a story that somebody would want to read and would understand and would be compelling to them. And then they came back to us with that, and we checked it and refined it and said, okay, does this make sense to us? Does this ring true? And that, I'll talk about it on the next slide. That was a really important and challenging part of it, kind of making sure that the narrative felt authentic after this kind of creative intervention of turning it into a story. So we had quite a lot of backwards and forwards of checking, refining storylines, discussing different ways to tell that story. And when we were relatively happy with that, they went away and prepared the visuals that would go with it. And then you get another kind of refining process where the narrative and the visuals come together. And I was really surprised by, not surprised by how powerful that was, because I expect it to be, but also surprised by how challenging that was then, because it brings a whole new set of meanings to what you've got. So we had to go through another set of kind of refining and finalizing the meaning until we were really happy that the kind of visuals being presented matched the kind of story we were trying to tell, didn't bring in new inferences or new meanings that weren't accurate and so on. Until eventually we had a project that we were super happy with and went forward for publication. So it was quite a long process, and there was a lot of backwards and forwards. And I think that first step of having a really kind of clear set of shared aims, shared values, shared idea of who you want to speak to, what kind of story you want to tell, and setting up an idea that you can have the very, very clear kind of open channel of communication was really, really important in allowing the other steps to kind of work well. As I said, I think there were some challenges that came up with it. There are certainly things I found quite challenging. Firstly, there's this question of balancing kind of narrative with fact. So you're writing a comic book, and it's got to be engaging, and it's got to be interesting, and you're trying to tell a story that people will read and go away and feel inspired by. But we had 16 in-depth interviews and 6 focus groups with 6 to 8 people in each one. There are so many stories that came out of that data that you couldn't put them all in. And if you tried to put them all into a narrative, it would be kind of chaos. And so there is a kind of a creative element of it. And there was transparency in that within this process. We said, these are stories that are entirely based on real life, but they are semi-fictionalized because we had to combine elements to make a narrative that worked. So it's representative of the reality we found through our research, but it is also slightly kind of fictionalized to some extent to make it make sense as a narrative. And that was really tough, because sometimes we'd get a script back and we think it doesn't ring true. You know, the way this has been combined would be unrealistic for that person to have that many roles or that person to have had that many experiences. So there was a kind of a push and pull that was quite challenging, I think, and quite an interesting thing to engage with, to end up at a narrative that feels authentic, that we felt really reflected the reality of the situation, but that would engage a public who are not used to engaging with these issues and who would want to read more and do something. So that was kind of the first big challenge. It's linked to this kind of question of anonymity. So when we did our research, we told people, obviously, that they would be anonymous, that they were speaking to us on that basis, and that is how we gathered our data. When you present your information in this way, I think it challenged that at some points. That's one of the reasons we went for this kind of combined semi-fictionalized version, so that we didn't end up compromising anyone's anonymity. And I think finding the right tone for it. And, we're used to working in a certain formal tone, but finding the tone for the comic that was engaging, that was interesting, that would allow people to talk was quite tough sometimes. And finding the right visual tone. So sometimes we were really happy with the script, but when the visuals came through, you found it was introducing elements that jarred. And so thinking about kind of verbal tone or as well as visual tone was really, really important and a new experience for me. And finally, just letting go, because, as academics, I think our research is our baby sometimes, and it's difficult to listen to someone else who is also an expert in their own right in public engagement and communication. And sometimes you have to let go a little bit and say, okay, you're probably right. This is the right way to tell this story in this moment, to engage with the widest number of people. In terms of opportunities, I mean, obviously, number one is that you get this amazing, engaging, accessible format that you can use to talk to so many more people in so many more exciting ways. And the feedback we've had already has been brilliant on that. But I was also stressed, it's a really flexible resource. We've got this wonderful comic that reads well as a comic, but you can also take the way it was structured. Each case study has 3 sub-stories, so you can remove bits and use them on their own in presentations, in other ways. So it's become a much more flexible resource than I think I thought. I think it works really well to share on social media and so on. And I think it's not a kind of a one and done situation. We've started this, and it's opened lots of doors already for future ideas, future collaborations, future uses. And so it's almost like you start that ball rolling, and then it kind of carries on and it snowballs a bit for more opportunities. And that's been really exciting. So already part of the work has been featured in an exhibition at SOAS, in a physical exhibition where people were able to walk around and kind of engage with it in that way instead. And I know that Michaelina, this is a kind of seamless transition to your to your section, because I know that Michaelina's been also already looking at ways of kind of developing it further into a kind of a new immersive and educational experience. So I don't know if you wanted to step in and speak about that.
Brilliant. Thank you, Elly and Michaelina.
Thank you. So thank you, Elly, and thank you, Adrian. It's nice to see like the progression of the different types of mediums that we have been using in our research to communicate our outcomes or findings and engage with wider audiences. So I'm sorry I don't have a presentation today, but I can turn my camera off if we want to pretend it's a podcast. So you can just stare at a blank space if you want. We won't do that. So as Elly kind of mentioned, our project was quite a long project and it had a lot of ups and downs. So we didn't really have any of these the impact of outputs such as graphic comics and podcasts built into the project. We kind of happened upon it. We had quite a large underspend in the project due to COVID, not being able to travel for research. So we spent a lot of time trying to figure out how we're going to communicate our results, what would be the best way to engage with audiences and whatnot, and how to tell these stories. And Elly was talking about stories. So we decided, kind of had an initial conversation around podcasts, and then kind of put that on the back burner while we tried to think of different ways to spend our money and to engage with audiences and tell the stories. When I was in Bosnia, so I led the Bosnia case study, so that was looking at the youth to adult transition. So I looked at and worked with former underage fighters in Bosnia and Herzegovina, so young people who fought in the different militaries and armies during the 92 to 95 conflict. And it's a group that's not very well known. There's not much information about them. And when you think of former underage fighters or child soldiers, you don't necessarily think of Bosnia. So in one of the workshops, one question that we asked is, how do you feel that this could be communicated, your stories, your ideas, the findings from this project, to wider audiences? How do we engage? And they came up with the idea of podcasts. So we as a team had another conversation about podcasting, and we decided to take it forward. So it wasn't built in, and it was kind of more rushed. So we didn't necessarily spend as much time around thinking about how we would develop a series and could we carry on for a second series. And we had the money, and it cost between 13,000 to 15,000 to produce a podcast. We worked with a company called Research Podcasts, and we developed Generation Peace. So there's one series with 6 episodes, which were 30 to 40 minutes each, and they drew on each of the case studies from the project. So we have one episode on Bosnia, Colombia, Iraqi Kurdistan, Iraq, Algeria, and then we had a wrap-up episode. And this was really about looking at the different ways that the roles that young people play in conflict and how we can challenge the roles, and the kind of traditional thinking or the mainstream thinking about the role that young people play in conflict. So this, we found and spoke to Research Podcasts. We had meetings with them, and we decided to take on their full package because none of us had ever done this before. We were novices. We needed support and guidance. So what it meant is that we had a training workshop for the whole team, which we got together, and we discussed our ideas around what a podcast was, because some of us were very avid podcast listeners. Some had never engaged, Elly, with podcasts. So we had discussions around what we thought they were. Do we have any favorite podcasts? Like, what did we like about each of the podcasts that we listened to? What were the elements that we could bring in from those podcasts to our podcast? We did training around editing, around promotion, how to develop a podcast. We had a producer. So it was all the elements that go on behind the scene. And there's a lot. And it took us 6 months from training to the release of the final episode to develop all of these podcasts. And that was really quick because we were on a very tight schedule due to the deadlines of funding. So we decided on wanting to tell stories again, and that we didn't want it to be too academic because that really only reached a certain audience. So we wanted to try to attempt to bring it into more of a storytelling, to engage with students, various different audiences that might not be attracted to an academic podcast. From that, we decided who was going to present the podcast, and there were really no takers. Nobody really wanted to present. So I ended up doing it, and I had to attend training. So it was all about how to speak when you are presenting something. So it's a lot about breathing, how to breathe, how to have a good microphone. It's very important to have a good microphone, how you record it. And then we worked with our producer. So each episode we had a meeting, and we discussed what we were going to talk about. So what was the point of this episode? What did we want the audience to understand after or have communicated to them after they had finished listening? So the producer would speak to all of us. She would ask us questions. She would create a script. So I had a script which I needed to read to introduce, as well as questions. The questions then would be given to the guests. So we selected specific people who were going to be on each of the episodes, usually between 3 and 4 people, because, giving people maybe 5 minutes to talk and then have a wrap up after each episode. So a script was prepared. They were given to the different guests so that they could prepare beforehand. We recorded on Zoom for usually 45 minutes, testing the sound, and then allowing for any issues, or like if somebody said something that they wanted to have cut, we would go back and re-ask the question. So it's not like it's not live. You can go back and edit. Then the podcast, then the recording went to an editor who edited it down. Then it was published, and promoted somewhat. And each of the episodes were then turned into transcripts. So all of the transcripts of each of the episodes are now available on Peer through our Coventry University. And we each episode has a DOI so that if anybody wants to reference the transcript, they can use it in academic publishing and things like that. So it's all available. Now we have Generation Peace. It's out there. It's in the ether. We're proud of it. We hope that it piques some people's interest, not just academics, and that it communicates the experiences and stories of our participants. There are a few things that I feel that we could have done differently. Is first to build it into the initial funding bid and think about the podcast from the very beginning and how you're going to start building the series, if you want to do a series or 2 series from the very beginning of data collection and the field work. It would have been nice as well to have more time to develop the series idea instead of it being quite rushed, so that we'd be able to think about it and how we want it to present, how to present it. Personally, I would have gone for more of a less academic approach, more based around storytelling, weaving in little sound bites, music, things like that to really draw the listener in. And we also only did the podcast in English. And as Elly mentioned, there were different countries, and she did Colombia, I did Bosnia. It would have been nice to have each of the episodes in the local language so the people that we worked with could hear their story in their local language and share with others who maybe didn't necessarily speak English. Also, the idea of a follow-up series would have been wonderful, but we didn't have the money to do that, as well as promotion. Finally, and I'll finish up. Thank you, David. Elly did mention that we are applying for follow-up funding. So it is to create an immersive exhibition. So the idea is to take snippets of the podcast as well as bits and pieces of the comic and create an immersive exhibition in Coventry, Brighton, and London. And from that, we would also take that audio-visual material and the content from the exhibition and create a learning package or a CPD for teachers in secondary schools, and then test that in Coventry and London. And from that, we would also build a second CPD kind of course for academics and practitioners and how to use this type of audiovisual material for impact and engaging with wider audiences. So that's what we're hoping to do. We'll see what happens. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Mick, and thank you, Elly, and thank you, Adrian. 3 fantastic presentations and all very kind of different elements of this world, and yeah, it's given me plenty to think about and questions. Does anybody have any questions from the floor? We've got one hand up. I can take a couple of questions, so please raise your hand. We've got about 15 minutes or so. James, and then Laura.
Hi, thank you very much, everyone, for your presentations. Really interesting, and certainly in the case of the podcast, directly inspiring, because I've written a pilot episode into a funding project I'm currently running, alongside a animated explainer video. I think I've got 2 questions, and they may be relevant to all 3 of you, so whoever wants to answer is fine. The first one is just how, if at all, did you think about the issue of temporality of your output? It's an issue, obviously, for all of us in journal articles, not just because of the length of time of peer review and so on, but kind of making sure that, how did you think about making sure the output kind of stands kind of either separate to the project and goes beyond the project's lifespan, or maybe that wasn't a consideration, and if so, that's interesting. And secondly, just following on, Adrian, from your point around impact case studies and so on, I just wondered whether any of you have got reflections on and how we begin to use really innovative techniques like this to capture impact, because obviously often it's around demonstrating change, evidencing that change, and so on and so forth, and an extent of interaction might be evidential in terms of 10,000 followers and so on, but kind of then making that kind of logical leap. And I just, to be honest, I don't care that much about it, in the sense that I think it's just good to do these things anyway, but I accept that all our seniors do love a good ref impact case study. So any reflections on that would be appreciated. Thank you very much.
Super. And Laura?
Sorry, I seem to have forgotten how to use Zoom. I could barely raise my hand. Thank you, everyone. This was really interesting. It was actually really interesting to see kind of the different spectrums of that sort of public engagement and going from social media to podcasts and the comics. My question was specifically to Adrian. And thank you so much. I thought it was really interesting kind of how you showed it. And obviously I started following immediately because I had a look around. I wanted to ask, do you have a TikTok channel? Have you considered it? And if you have, what are the benefits of it? If you don't, kind of what's the thinking process there? I kind of wanted to hear more about that.
And thank you, Laura. I'm just going to throw in a quick question for Elly while we're at it, and then I'll do it. Because I think Elly, the difference in what you did to Mick and Adrian is you had to represent people on paper. So you actually, and it sort of jumped up a little bit when you had conversations of anonymity and also questions of getting the right fit, because you're adding an entirely new dimension, because we're maybe used to kind of representing people's voices, or representing people's ideas, but we don't often get the chance to represent them like in a very brutal way. Like, this is what we think you would look best like in this drawing. Did that pose any, I'm going to say really anonymity challenge, because I'm sure that anonymity, but did that bring any extra considerations that you were literally drawing the people, or the company was drawing the people that you were talking to? Okay, I'll hand it over to you all to reflect on the questions. Just do it in the same order as we spoke.
Thank you very much. It was nice to see all three of us speaking to the same thing, and we all seem like fish out of water when we started as well, which is interesting. I will let others speak to temporality because they specifically did it around projects. I know we're short on time. With regards to the impact question, so I wasn't setting out to create an impact case study, but I did research for another university when I was a PhD student, and one of their impact case studies used YouTube as evidence of impact on the public. So I come through all the comments that were on YouTube trying to get together the evidence for that. Now, cut forward 15 years later, it's quite clear to me that Instagram is producing a body of evidence, a mixture of quantitative and qualitative data that far surpasses anything that I was finding when I was in researching YouTube. So you've got all your quantitative data, but also qualitatively, lots of comments around how much people had learned. You can also insert polls into any video in the blurb below. So you could, I think on Just War Theory, I did something like, have you heard of Just War Theory before? I can't remember the output of the poll off the top of my head, but you could clearly, if I was trying to think, oh, I've got a project that I'm going to do next year. For example, I've thought this around my book on the Central African Republic. Could I do a series on Instagram and then try and factor in how I would measure and map impact? So I think that's definitely something where the sites themselves are a lot better. And the second question, I'm on TikTok. Yes, I launched on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram at the same time. TikTok, the engagement. So the academics that I've spoken to on TikTok say that you can snowball much faster to much bigger views, but they've changed the algorithm. So I don't think that's the same anymore. I'm no expert on the TikTok algorithm, but the engagement seems to be far less. Like, it's just not substantive at all. Whereas I don't mean to be blunt, but the IQ on Instagram seems to be a lot higher. So that's just what I've found. Thanks.
Right, Elly.
Thanks, guys. Very quickly on impact, I think there's one really important question, because I think there's real opportunity in terms of having impact and measuring impact. Because even though we didn't, as Michaelina said, we were kind of rushed with some of these things, there are some built-in metrics that we can access in terms of how many times have things been downloaded, how, so that's really helpful. But does it matter when I think institutionally a lot of universities and the kind of that ref framework are skewed to caring about certain types of impact? My kind of experience of talking about impact case studies and so on is there is still very much a bias to, well, impact really matters if it's getting a kind of large institutional body to change its framework or to introduce something. And I think we've still got quite a lot of work to say actually that impact with people is really, really important and should be kind of equally valued. So I think there's still this ongoing work there to really kind of make that count. To your question, David, about kind of, representing on paper, I had to really get my head around the fact that this is kind of an artistic representation. It's an artistic intervention, and it took me a while to let go of kind of seeking absolute accuracy and being like, no, this is kind of to a lot of extent an artistic response to a set of data and that's really, really important, and that kind of helped me to frame it in my head. There was something of disconnect the first time I saw the images, and I think what was very interesting is that it did, I kind of thought once we had the script there, that was that, and then there were certain things that came in the images that we went, actually no, and not necessarily images of people, but of places that felt stereotypical. And so there was kind of a second level of checking had to happen in that to make sure that biases didn't come in that we weren't comfortable with. But what was really important in that is that we had local partners that we could double check things with, and we could go back with our partners we've been working with for 5 years by that point, say, are you comfortable with this? Are you happy with this? We couldn't go all the way back to the people because, there's the kind of data anonymity disconnect and so on, but we were at least able to kind of do that double checking in that way. But certainly, to me, that was one of the biggest challenges, is kind of really understanding that this wasn't, like the podcast, a kind of quite factual interaction with the data. This was actually an artistic one to a lot of extent, and that does changes the game a bit, and it can take a while to get your head around it.
Yeah, thank you, Elly. And Mick, before we wrap up.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so in regarding to temporality, so like with the podcast, it's more about capturing moments and stories. So they will always be there, and those stories have been recorded, for example. And your point about impact. So I've been told by our impact office, our ref office, or whatever they're called now, that like downloads don't count. So they're not keen on like, oh, you got so many downloads. That it doesn't seem to matter to them, because as Elly was saying, they just see impact as this, whereas we've got over here the comics, etc., etc. It's totally different. So it is about kind of changing the way that they think. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's brilliant. Well, thank you so much for that. I mean, I would encourage everybody on the call to go and look at the 3 case studies that we've got and get ideas, because I think one of the things that cuts across everyone is this, like, as Adrian said, that kind of moral need to share the conversation and speak to people, and although we speak together as a community and we enjoy that interaction. I mean, speaking about going to BISA in Brighton, that's a great interaction with like-minded people at our level, but not our level, but within our clique, our bubble. But actually, the joy and the importance we all kind of share in making sure that some of the stuff that matters dearly to us is kind of talked about beyond the places we're in, because as Adrian's rightly said, like, to people, this is interesting, it matters, it gets people engaged, people are already engaged, and it's just found them another outlet in which to kind of use that engagement really productively. And it's one of the joys that we get to research this day in, day out of our lives, and whereas you can speak to people that only get to read the newspaper after 6 p.m. or go online after the kids go to bed. and we've got the amazing ability to actually look at this day in, day out, and being able to share with a full cross section of society is wonderful. And the examples offered are absolutely fantastic in demonstrating that. So yes, in wrapping up, thank you again, Adrian. Thank you, Elly. Thank you, Michaelina, for your time and presentations. It's really appreciated. Everyone else, go and find them online and what they do. We will be in touch. If you're not signed up to our working group, please do. We'll be in touch on email for our next speaker. We've got a book talk lined up by Nina Willen. I need to put that in the diary, but we're looking in mid to late November on intervention in the Sahel. So, okay, and so I'll leave it there, bang on 3 o'clock. Super. Thanks everyone for coming.